Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a really good question the other day from a viewer regarding feathered treble hooks and whether or not I like to use them. And I thought that would make a great video topic because I do think there is absolutely a time and a place for a feathered treble hook, but it's not always something that I use. So I want to walk you through when and where I like to use them, why I like to use them, why I think they can be beneficial, why I think they might actually hurt you at times, and hopefully it gives you a little bit more confidence to use a feathered treble hook or not use a feathered treble hook. But this is something that I've addressed a little bit on the channel over the years, but I figured it would make a good topic for today, especially since I've had a viewer request that I talk about a feathered or dressed treble hook. Before I do get into that, though, I want to remind you guys that I do additional content with my members only channel. So if you're looking for a couple extra monthly videos, a monthly live stream, direct access to me, check out my members only page. You can go to my YouTube homepage, click the join button, and find out more regarding that. I also do a Tackle Warehouse affiliate. So if you're looking to purchase tackle and you want to support the channel, please click on my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. The little bit of money I make from that comes right back into creating content for everyone in YouTube land. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a dressed or feathered treble hook. The reason I say dressed treble hook is because there's a lot of different material that you can use, not just a feathered material, but in this case, this is actually a Flashabou material. This is one that I hand tie. I personally prefer Flashabou, this kind of the holographic prism color. It's just a clear. The reason I do that is I personally feel like this looks more like a tail, the actual like bait fish tail, than say a white feather or colored feather. So personally, this is the one that I like the most. It's just the prism Flashabou. So when I tie dress treble hooks, that's generally what I use. Now, I do use different colors sometimes, but specifically, this is the one that I like to use the most. A lot of people out there like to use feathers. Other people will actually use different materials as well. You can get like synthetic hairs. You can get like buck tail hair, so deer hair. Lots of different things. You really can use whatever it is that you want. You can buy a lot of these pre-made for you just to swap out hooks. I'll put a link for that so you guys can see what I'm talking about if you don't want to tie them yourself. But there is definitely a really good time and a place for them. So in this case, I've got this on a topwater bait. For me, a feathered treble hook is a great topwater addition, specifically because, again, you're going for creating a silhouette on the surface. So when this bait's sitting on the surface, that to me actually does look like a tail of a bluegill or of a bait fish. And just going back to why I like this material, if you have bluegill in your lakes or pumpkin seed, matches that kind of that turquoisey green iridescent look of a bluegill tail really well. That's one of the reasons I really like this material specifically. But if you're talking about the baits to use these on, topwaters are a great bait to add a feathered treble hook to. A lot of people like to put them on their jerk baits. A lot of people like to put them on crankbaits, and a lot of people like to put them on lipless crankbaits. Those are kind of the I guess the majority of baits that I think you see feathered treble hooks on, but you can pretty much put them on almost anything as a replacement to a treble hook. So, you know, you're talking glide baits and swim baits, things like that. You can definitely do it as well. I guess what I would say is don't limit yourself just to those baits. If you think you might be able to add it to replace a treble hook with a feathered treble hook on whatever bait it is, give it a try. See what you think with it. So there's a couple of things that you got to recognize when talking about the feathered treble hooks or what that does. Now, first and foremost, you need to recognize the treble hook itself and see how thick the dressing is. Now, this really varies. Some baits you'll see have giant amounts of material, whether it's like whole feathers, they're real long, and then other ones will just have one single feather. You know, in this case, this is not much material. So people will really change up the amount of material that they use, but you have to recognize that the more material that is put on the hook, the more drag you're going to create. The less material means the less drag. So you're going to get more movement with less material, more movement or less movement with more material. So when I say movement, I'm not talking about movement out of the dressing. I'm talking about movement out of the bait. In some cases, you may want less movement. In other cases, you may want more movement from your bait. So if we're talking about, say, fishing a topwater, so this is what I consider a target topwater. This is a Rebel Pop R. I like to have feathered treble hooks on it because it actually prevents my bait from moving out of the strike zone. So with a topwater bait, your dress treble hook will actually act as some resistance to the bait wanting to move. It acts as like, it puts brakes on your bait. Let's put it that way. So if I throw this up under a bush and I don't want to work my bait out of there too fast, I actually want my bait to stay under that bush or under that dock or next to that stump. Your feathered treble hook, your material will actually help keep that bait there. So I can twitch this bait without moving it quite as far. Say if I had a undressed treble hook, that bait will actually pull out of there faster. It'll actually move well or carry that momentum of the movement that you enacted in the bait more than if you have a dressed treble hook. So for me, topwater baits, I actually like to have a dressed treble hook, not just because it gives me the silhouette on the surface of a tail of a fish, but also because it helps me keep my bait in the strike zone. The other thing it does is it helps you walk your baits tighter together. So if you're working a walking topwater bait, it will actually keep your bait tighter. And a lot of times I want that. But if you want your topwater bait to glide further apart, then you probably don't want to actually have a feathered treble hook. So it's something to keep in mind with that. Jerk baits are another thing where I have definitely seen times where a feathered treble hook will outperform an unfeathered treble hook on a jerk bait. But what I will tell you is if you want your bait to slash more, less material is absolutely key. Too much material and your bait will not slash erratically like you want a jerk bait to. So you got to recognize that as well. If I'm fishing a treble hook, a dressed treble hook on a jerk bait, I'm almost always going with a lot less material than more material. In fact, I'll almost always trim it down to the point where it's barely past the hook. But that's one of the things that, is a benefit as well to the dress treble hook is it does do a good job of kind of hiding your hook. And anytime you're talking about fishing in scenarios where the fish might get a good look at your bait, hiding that hook is good. And that's one of the reasons I like it on a jerk bait or like it on a topwater is because it does kind of hide that hook in the material itself. So that's great from that standpoint. So not only are you creating that bait fish profile with the tail now based on the dress material, but you've also created something that kind of hides some of the hook and it helps. But I will say, just because it does help hide the hook doesn't mean I generally always like to use it in clear water. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If the water is really clear, I actually don't want the fish to get a great look at that dress treble hook because what they can do at times is key in on that dress treble hook and therefore they start nipping at the tail. I would much rather have them hitting the head of the bait. Now, in an ideal situation, the fish will recognize that dress treble hook is the tail and therefore they want to hit the front of the bait. That's how they generally try to eat their prey or their forage is head first. So if they can recognize that tail is the tail of the bait, that's great. But what I've found in clear water is a lot of times they'll actually prefer to nip at that tail, which isn't a good thing from a hookup and a landing percentage. So if I can get away in clear water without throwing a dress treble on a jerk bait, then I will generally do that. If I'm fishing a little bit more off-colored water, I actually then do like to throw it because it bulks up the profile and it gives the fish a better idea as to where that bait is and where the tail of the bait is. In clear water, they can see the tail, so it's not necessarily something that they need to know. They know what direction the bait's going. In off-colored water, any little bit to help them identify what that bait is and where the head of the bait is, to me, is beneficial from that standpoint. So those are just some things to keep in mind. So if we're going to go back to your baits, though, mentioning a crankbait, I think fishing a dress treble hook on a crankbait and a lipless is fine and works very well. But keep in mind again, if you're looking for your baits to really deflect well, having too much material on that treble hook can be a hindrance. So if you're working a square bill off of lay downs or off of stumps and you really want it to deflect great, go with a lot less material. That is definitely something to keep in mind. Now, the last thing I will say, and this goes back to personal experience, there have definitely been times where I'm fishing on a day where the fish are just not aggressive. And what I found is that they will hone in on that tail. Like you guys have probably seen it where you're working a jerk bait or working a topwater bait. And it's funny, this happens a lot of times during like the spawn period where the fish are not truly looking to eat the bait. It's almost more like they are testing it. And what they'll actually do is come up and just nip on that feathered treble hook. Like, and if you're fishing a topwater like this popper, what you'll actually see is almost like watching a bobber. You won't see a big movement. You might see a little swirl under the bait, but it just goes whoop and disappears. And that's because those fish came up and they literally grabbed that treble hook, that rear treble hook, and that's the only part they ate. You find this a lot with jerkbait fish too, where they'll just come up and they just nip at it. You don't see their mouth explode and suck the whole bait in. They come up and they just nip at it. And to me, that is a very beneficial time to throw a feather treble hook, is when the fish are not in a true feeding mode. They're coming up and they're just like nipping at it. And I think sometimes really what they think it is a separate little minnow. They don't recognize the whole bait as a big forage. It's almost like the tail itself is just a little minnow. And from that standpoint, there's a definite bonus to using that when fishing is tough. But, major takeaway from this video, guys, is there's definitely times and places you want to use it. You definitely want to recognize if there's specific colors of the treble material that might work, that you can go with too much material or too little material, that you need to recognize that it can and can help and hurt the performance of the bait. But it is definitely something that, in my opinion, you should have some on hand, where if you're alternating between baits trying to figure out what works. If you feel like you've got a bait that's getting a lot of interest from the fish, but they're not connecting with it the way you want, try just adding a feathered treble hook. That's when I find it makes the biggest difference. If you fish in a jerk bait and you're like, man, they're just not fully committing to this bait, instead of switching colors, switch to a feathered treble hook. See if that makes a difference before going to a different color jerkbait. Ultimately, there is a time and a place. Like I said, I have a lot of baits where I absolutely have to have a feathered treble hook, a lot of different topwater baits, and then I definitely will work them into the routine when fishing other baits that require treble hooks. So let me know in the comment section, guys. Do you have baits that you feel like have to have feathered treble hooks? Do you think feathered treble hooks help? Do they hurt? I'd love to hear from you guys as well. Personally, I carry a couple boxes of various sizes of feathered treble hooks that I'm pretty much always putting on and taking off and trying a lot of different things with. So yeah, I hope this helps. I hope this answers the viewer question. If it does, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new one coming out tomorrow.